My friends, what a disaster! Ukraine just got collapsed as Russian forces stormed the fortress city of Siversk. And this officially ended the longest battle of the Ukraine war. It was such a humiliating defeat that the mainstream media barely mentioned it. You see, at the end of July 2022, Russian forces had finally captured Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. They stood just 40 kilometers from Slavyansk, ready to smash through the final fortress line in Donbass. But a small, unassuming town blocked their path. Siversk, a thorn in Russia's side that just refused to yield. Over the months and years that followed, the Ukrainian military transformed Siversk into an impregnable fortress. Even when Bakhmut fell in May 2023, these Ukrainian troops refused to abandon their positions around Siversk. They continued holding the northern flank and keeping the enemy at arm's length from the defensive belt of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. 3 very long years had passed. It seemed nothing could dislodge Ukrainian forces from this iron bastion. Nothing could get through, not even porcupine tanks. And suddenly, it all collapsed.
Leave me alone!
The fall of Siversk seemed so sudden and unexpected that the general staff of the armed forces of Ukraine outright dismissed 2 brigade commanders, as well as the commander of the entire 11th Army Corps for this humiliating defeat. And you know what's the worst? It's not even their fault. Just scapegoats for a much bigger crisis. Like Zelensky said in chapter 2, when you fail on the battlefield, blame someone else.
Може, хватить проёбывать, блядь?
So in this video, we will explore exactly what happened, how the Russians stormed this fortress, and why the dismissal of the Ukrainian commanders was not justified. But now you know my love for cocoa powder. Look, I ordered a brand new jar from Black Forest. But today, let's put this aside and let's talk about this, NMN. Big Pharma is developing a $3,000 version of it. So they're trying to ban the cheaper version. Classic move. NMN is a naturally occurring molecule that the body converts into NAD, which is essential for energy production, DNA repair, and overall cellular function. Now, a Harvard clinical trial found that 1,000 milligrams of NMN daily safely increased NAD levels by up to 2 times. Researchers also observed reductions in fat mass, cholesterol, and blood pressure, confirming NMN's potential to reverse key markers of metabolical age. Here's Professor David Sinclair from the Center of the Biology of Aging from Harvard Medical School talking about it.
Well, what I believe doesn't so much matter, but the scientific evidence points to taking a supplement every day, a gram of NMN, which is this precursor, stands for nicotinamide mononucleotide for the aficionados. Just swallowing one of those, or 1,000 milligrams, is enough to double your NAD.
That's straight from Harvard Medical School. 1 capsule a day, and your NAD explodes by 100%. Your cells will literally think they're 25 again. Your wife or your girlfriend won't be able to keep up. So if you're thinking about getting NMN, do it fast. Because when Big Pharma finally figures out how to patent this, it's game over. Black Forest NMN is the GOAT of NAD boosters. Made in the USA, GMP certified, and manufactured in an FDA-regulated facility. So you might want to stock up, and to make your life easier, Black Forest just launched their amazing New Year, New Me biggest deal of the year, and it's insane. 40% off their best-selling NMN product. But act fast because it's available for 48 hours only. Link will be in the description below. Stock up before prices go up.
Мина в стволе! Выстрел!
The fall of Siversk, this impregnable bastion, was a real shock for the Ukrainian command. To fully understand what happened, we have no other choice but to start from the beginning. Modern-day Siversk was originally composed of a multitude of villages like Radivonivka and Chernogorivka. These were founded around the 1750s and settled by immigrants from Serbia. Why specifically Serbia, you might ask? Well, that's because the Russian Empire wanted the new inhabitants of this region to be as hostile to the Ottomans as possible. Just kidding. Not that far. I want to show you just how well Ukraine defended the Siversk salient. It all started in May 2022 with Russia's failed river crossing operation at Bilohorivka. And there flew the opportunity to take over Siversk quickly. It would then turn into the longest battle of the Ukraine war. This was a front line following the fall of Lysychansk. And then by September 1st, 2022, just before Ukraine's counteroffensives, you can see how much ground was regained by the Ukrainians by the 1st of November 2022. And then this was the front line around Siversk 1 year later by September 1st, 2023. As a matter of fact, the failure to take Siversk was the main reason why Russian forces made so little progress westwards after the capture of Bakhmut. Then we can see how little ground Russian forces actually gained after 2 years fighting in this sector by September 1st, 2024. And at last, that was the front line for the third year of the defense of Siversk on September 1st, 2025. Although we can observe some change as Russian forces advanced 5 kilometers westwards towards Siversk. This is why we call Siversk an iron bastion, a real thorn in Russia's side. Now it's important to note that this Russian formation responsible for the Siversk sector was the 3rd Combined Arms Army, formerly known as the 2nd Army Corps of the Luhansk People's Republic. Many of these men have been at war since 2014. So how come they couldn't take Siversk? Well, the problem is that although they're separatists and clearly have extensive combat experience, they're still Ukrainian at heart. And unfortunately, they also inherited from the full national tradition of corruption. Because of poor leadership, the Luhansk Corps suffered from corruption but also bribery and extensive extortion of its troops. This naturally led to high casualties, and cherry on the ruble, the commanders of this 2nd Army Corps of the LPR massively exaggerated their battlefield gains, and then sent false reports up the hierarchy to make it seem as if they were making progress. But in late 2024, when the Russian High Command finally visited that part of the front, the masquerade was over. The commander of the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade was dismissed, same thing for all the battalion commanders, and it's possible the commanders of the 6th and 123rd Brigades were also relieved from duty. The enemy was in disarray, and Ukraine's 11th Army Corps was sipping pina colada as they prepared to hold Siversk for a 4th consecutive year. But eventually their luck ran out. My last update for the Siversk sector was on the 17th of September 2025, as Russian forces fought for a village called Serebryanka. Ukrainian forces had to defend a 20-kilometer front, but with their debacle in the Serebryansky forest, their positions around the settlement of Serebryanka suddenly became weakened. The next day on the 12th, Ukrainian drone operators of the Ukrainian 81st Air Mobile Brigade targeted enemy forces at the center of Serebryanka. By that point, the reshuffling of Russia's 3rd Army brought positive results, and the former Luhansk militias were slowly picking up the pace. Instead of a frontal assault, they grinded their way on both the northern and southern flanks, slowly enveloping Siversk. As part of this northern push, the village of Serebryanka finally fell around the 25th of September. Fast forward a month to the 23rd of October, when a Russian armored column charged past the settlement of Serebryanka, only to be halted 5 kilometers further, just north of Siversk. The lead element of this column was a tank equipped with a mine trawler, but despite its porcupine-like defenses, it was eventually immobilized by Ukrainian FPV drones. However, that was simply a tactical success for the AFU, because by the 28th of October, the Russian 3rd Army had mopped up the sector between Siversk and the Siversky Donets River. The entire northern part of the front line was collapsing, and this is exactly what we expected in my previous report. Once Serebryanka falls, this will most likely bring Russian forces to this line right on the outskirts of Siversk. So that's how the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade was positioned in Serebryanka. Meanwhile, the Russian 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade also controlled the settlement of Vimka to the east, while the 88th Brigade held the southern outskirts of Zvanivka to the south. Everything was set for the big battle of Siversk to begin. Actually, let me rephrase that. Everything was set for Russia's 10th attempt to storm this fortress. Who knows, could be 14th, 17th, just as the Russian saying goes, as long as we're alive, we continue. The first objective of Russia's Third Army of the LPR was to reach the outskirts of the town of Siversk, preferably by bypassing enemy strongholds and secure a foothold inside the urban area, after which they could proceed to mop up the place block by block. Pretty standard, these guys gave up on fancy maneuvers. But to do so, they would first have to break through Ukraine's 11th Army Corps, composed of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, the 54th Mechanized Brigade, and the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, Edelweiss. Yeah, doesn't sound very Ukrainian. Is it me, or it strangely sounds like the name of a German mountain division from World War II? Actually, no, this is an old Slavic name that the Germans copied. The Ukrainian battle plan was simple: prevent an infantry-heavy urban battle. To do so, they would have to keep enemy forces at arm's length and let the drones rain on the attacker. For example, Ukrainian drone operators of the 81st Apache group targeted multiple Russian dugouts in the village of Serebryanka. However, by that point, Ukraine only had a 4-kilometer security zone around Siversk, and drones alone proved unable to halt Russian infantry infiltrations, especially with the cloudy and foggy weather of fall. Maxim Butolin, callsign Molot, a senior sergeant from the 54th Mechanized Brigade, said the following in an interview. Currently on our sector of the front, the enemy has finally finished introducing additional reserves. He has rotated in fresh units, and in principle has already begun the active phase of such offensive actions. So far, there have been no mechanized massive assaults, but there are all signs that everything will happen soon. He reported this to the media in early October, and this is literally what happened. Meanwhile, that same 54th Mechanized Brigade suffered from a shortage of manpower and relentlessly tried to fill in the ranks with one recruitment campaign after another. I don't want to be disrespectful, but they scraped the barrel for infantrymen. Come on, they even mobilized Santa Claus!
Я в дивізіоні самий найстаріший, да, я найстарший чи як. Бува звертаються до мене, як тільки прийшов до мене, і він був не по формі, а я, каже, дідушка, я говорю, який я дідушка? Я такий-то, такий-то. Він, а я ж все ж, не парубок моторний, хлопець хоч куди казав.
Meanwhile, young Ukrainian males in Kyiv are going from one rave to another. On the 29th of October, Russia's 3rd Command Arms Army of the LPR restarted offensive operations, as some of its infantry units advanced 1,500 meters before being stopped at the center of the settlement of Zvanivka. Simultaneously, 4 kilometers to the east, Russian storm detachments from the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade of the LPR made some progress along the rail embankment. In this video, you can see how the stormtrooper simply throws in an explosive satchel inside the dugout to clear it. And they do that for every dugout they find. The next day, they advanced another 2 kilometers. By then, forward elements of the 123rd Brigade were only 500 meters away from the first houses of Siversk. They were so close they could smell the fresh borscht from Babushka's kitchen. But the final assault on Siversk would have to wait. The first week of November was relatively calm, but it's like living with a Latina girlfriend. This calm should be more worrying than anything else. Anyway, on the 9th of November, assault detachments of the 1st Zarya Battalion of the 123rd Brigade cleared trenches 700 meters away from Siversk. The entire attack was preceded by wave after wave of bomber drones, which hunted down the few Ukrainian riflemen still holding the front line. Here you can see the massive trench bastions the Ukrainians built in 2022, the ones that initially prevented the Russians from capturing the town. However, in the age of drones, these have somewhat become obsolete. Either riflemen man the trenches and expose themselves from above to enemy drones, or alternatively they hide in dugouts only to be flushed out by stormtroopers throwing rusty 60-year-old anti-tank mines, aka the Soviet version of whack-a-mole. By the 14th of November, it's Ukraine's northern flank that started cracking. as the Russian 7th Motor Rifle Brigade stormed and secured this small village along the banks of the Siversk Donets River called Dronivka. Here you can see how the storm elements of the 1st Assault Battalion Slavyansk advanced while being covered by friendly drones, who systematically destroyed enemy strong points. Any Ukrainian riflemen that were detected were immediately hammered with FPV drones, and this whether they were positioned in trenches or inside the village. The drones that targeted Dronivka literally acted as close air support, and they did so with devastating precision. Here we can even see a drone strike right in the middle of a group of 4 Ukrainian soldiers. That's how Dronivka came under Russian control. 3 days later, Russian storm detachments from the 123rd Brigade attacked from the south and reached the first houses of Siversk. In the following footage, we can see a team of 5 Ukrainian soldiers crossing over a railway line. On the map, we can see that it happened in Siversk. We can also observe how the Ukrainian rifle team advanced through bushes and then crossed a railway line somewhere in this sector. This means they were retreating towards the city center. But as they approached this set of houses, they got ambushed. The lead element immediately falls to the ground, KIA. The remaining 4 escape into the woods where they then get ambushed and targeted by Russian bomber drones. Fear caused these men to bunch up together, but the best thing to do in such situations is really to spread out, especially in the age of drones. Instead of 100% chances of being hit, if they all run away in different directions, well, each one has only 25% chances of being followed by the bomber drone. Something worth studying though is that never in history have soldiers been so alone on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the stronghold of Zvanivka, 4 kilometers south of Siversk, still seemed to hold. That's when the howitzers of the 2nd Artillery Brigade unleashed some massive loads on the village. The Ukrainians quickly found themselves in a sticky situation, because the next day on the 18th, it's from the east that the enemy attacked. After securing these massive trench lines I showed you before, Russian rifle teams managed to push right into the town of Siversk.
Into the breach!
Here we can see Russian infantrymen intercepted by enemy drones as they crossed this big, flat, open terrain. However, some forward elements did manage to secure a foothold in the first set of houses of the fortress city of Siversk. On the 20th of November, Ukrainian drone operators of the 10th Mountain Brigade targeted a Russian logistics robot in the northern part of Zvanivka. To be honest, I wasn't even sure that was something worth mentioning. But then I thought that this meant Russian patrols successfully infiltrated that sector, and that they were now getting resupplied on the low with UGVs. And if you pay attention, right before the strike, the robot was empty, meaning it was on its way back, and that the Russian soldiers secured the bag. This is when we have to zoom out to get the big picture. Russia has multiple armies moving at the same time in this direction. You see, 24 hours later, Yampil, this strategic village located north of the Siversk Donets River, fell to Russian forces.
A devastating loss for the enemy!
From there, Russian patrols could cross the river with small boats and potentially encircle the Ukrainian garrison in Siversk. With this flanking operation shaping up in the north, it's very likely the Ukrainian command of the 11th Army Corps redirected significant forces to plug the gaps in that sector. To make matters even worse, just behind Siversk, Russian UAV operators intercepted an entire team of Ukrainian Mavic drone operators. It doesn't happen often that the hunters suddenly become the hunted. Simultaneously, other Russian drone units mopped up remaining pockets of resistance. We can see how the drones dropped grenades in multiple dugouts and isolated buildings. And I'm not done! That's also how a Ukrainian T-72 tank was destroyed in the settlement of Sviatopokrovsky by Russian drones. So, to summarize everything, from an operational perspective, the Ukrainian garrison of Siversk was getting outflanked, and from a tactical perspective, Russian drone strikes severely attrited enemy formations. Ukraine doesn't really have an edge in drone warfare anymore, and that's something that should worry the general staff of the AFU. 2 days later, after all this pounding, the Russian 88th Motor Rifle Brigade raised the white-blue-red banner on Zvanivka. We can even have a granular look at how exactly they did it. First, an artillery barrage pulverized the Ukrainian strongholds, followed by swarms of drones that cleared the destroyed buildings. While Ukrainian troops were pinned down, Russian infantry rushed to the village at all speed, while the second wave mopped up the dugouts left behind. The path was cleared for the final assault on the village itself. In the following footage, we can see how an armored vehicle disembarked some infantrymen at the center of the settlement. Then, in groups of two, they cleared the entire settlement, combing through every house and basement, one by one. It's interesting to see how in the US Army, the doctrinal baseline for such clearing operations is standardized around the four-man team, whereas France has for many years already shifted to the binôme or two-man teams as the default tactical element. In a way, French military doctrine was ahead of time. At the same time, 5 kilometers northwest of Siversk, Russian forces from the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade infiltrated the settlement of Platonivka. They really did so without getting spotted, because all Ukrainian drones could find were unmanned ground vehicles and some quads left behind. Actually, in that direction, we can also mention how the Russians immobilized an Italian-made Puma APC from the Ukrainian 81st Air Mobile Brigade. Time for this APC to switch sides, I guess. So, Siversk was getting outflanked both from the north and the south, and was now about to be encircled. As military wisdom says, never let the two tips touch. But there's more, because a third shaft entered the game, as some Russian elements had already gained a foothold inside Siversk from the east. But then the hammer fell on the 24th of November, when Russian storm detachments also entered the town from the northeast. This fortress that held enemy troops for over 3 years was about to collapse. Within 2 weeks, the situation in Siversk had turned for the worst. Remember what I said in my previous report. We can expect heavy fighting in the northern part of Siversk, especially near this industrial area. But that would not be the case. Russian forces purposely bypassed and avoided these highly fortified strongholds in the northern part of the city. Oh my god, what? You're telling me the Russian army can maneuver? As the Battle of Siversk was now underway, the Russians were already trying to sneak in from behind. On the 2nd of December, soldiers from the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade captured 3 Ukrainian soldiers in the settlement of Sviatopokrovske. This push was supported by swarms of FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian positions all across the village. This is typical of Soviet deep battle doctrine, where small sabotage and reconnaissance teams continuously probed enemy lines for weak points. But even then, further north, you had the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade making progress in Platonivka. In response, the Ukrainians hammered enemy positions with FPV drones. We can even observe a drone strike against a little boat. This confirms the theory we talked about just earlier. This means Russian troops located on the northern part of the Siversky Donets were now crossing the river to outflank Ukrainian defensive positions. But that's not all. From a logistics perspective, all of Ukraine's main supply roads were now under enemy fire. The only way for the Ukrainian garrison to be resupplied or to receive reinforcements was via narrow, mud-choked country tracks. If things couldn't go worse, on the 5th of December, the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade pivoted south and closed in on Siversk. However, the first element sent forward got chewed up by Ukrainian UAVs. Some of them were ambushed in open terrain, and others while wearing anti-thermal cloaks. Someone tell these guys this is not some Harry Potter-like invisibility cloaks. After a couple minutes, these cloaks heat up because of body temperature, turning them like blinking Christmas lights in the night. At the same time, maybe they're just the unlucky ones that got caught. 24 hours later, on the 6th of December, assault squads of the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade reached the center of Siversk, where they raised their colors. But moments later, the flag was targeted by drones of the Ukrainian 54th Mechanized Brigade. The battle is not over yet! Meanwhile, more and more Russian infantrymen were pushing into the town. Here's a good bird's-eye view of Siversk. We can observe a couple of multi-level commie blocks surrounded by hundreds of residential homes. On the 7th of December, the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade hammered the eastern edge of Sviatopokrovske with numerous drone strikes. So while the Ukrainian garrison was fighting off the Russian troops from the front, they were now getting turned on their right flank. Nonetheless, in Siversk, the Ukrainian defenders tenaciously fought for every building in a desperate attempt to push back the Russians until reinforcements finally arrive. However, nobody would come to their rescue, and by the 10th of December, everything east of the railway line fell under Russian control. Here you can see Russian soldiers entering basements and taking over the train station as they face enemy drones. Meanwhile, in support of this offensive, Russian artillery blasted the western side of town still under Ukrainian control with heavy ordnance. By this point, most of Siversk had been reduced to ruins, and there were no meaningful terrain features or large buildings for the defenders to anchor their defense. By the 11th of December, the drone operators of the Ukrainian 54th Mechanized Brigade were overwhelmed by the number of Russian troops pushing across town. And then, it was over. That's how the 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade of the LPR raised its colors on Siversk.
Победа будет за нами.
It officialized the capture of this fortress by recording flags literally all across town.
Leave me alone!
Even worse, as proof of this complete collapse of Ukrainian defenses, Russian patrols were already detected 2 kilometers beyond Siversk. It's as if the Ukrainian garrison just vanished. But then, it's not over. As a sign of defiance, the Ukrainian flag appeared right at the center of the town, on one of the main buildings of the train station. However, it wasn't really defiance, more like desperation. The story goes that Brigadier General Dmytro Bratishko of Operational Command East was so furious when he learned of the loss of Siversk that he demanded that a Ukrainian flag be raised by almost any means. That's how a Ukrainian flag was delivered by a ground robot to UAV operators of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, who then used drones to drop the flag on one of the buildings of the railway station in Siversk.
We are winning!
The meme is writing itself. However, this PR stunt could not change the reality on the ground. In the end, 3.5 years after the first Ukrainian defenders took up their positions, the fortress of Siversk fell into enemy hands. But it's important to note that no other town in Ukraine resisted as long to the enemy as this one. It was a real feat of arms. Later that day, the Telegram channel of the 54th Mechanized Brigade wrote the following: "We held out until the last moment and defended Siversk, but the enemy proved to be stronger. All our guys who held the defense, they are heroes." So why did Siversk fall so quickly? There seemed to be a real cover-up because I could barely find any Ukrainian articles that talked about what happened. Although there was this article by the media of Chasnu, they interviewed Oleg, a serviceman of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, and he said, "Siversk did not fall abruptly. The Russians had been pushing back our positions for several weeks before that." This is true, and this is something I demonstrated in this video. Oleg also stated that the poor weather allowed the Russians to reach the city almost unhindered, due to the drone's limited visibility once it gets cloudy, and that the final role in this situation was played by the fact that the leadership of the defense forces and the responsible corps either did not know the real situation in the direction for a long time, or were convinced that they would be able to control it. This is the recurrent theme we hear from the Ukrainian side. And while still after years of war, things have not changed. The clowns up there in Ukraine's general staff have unrealistic expectations of their subordinate units. So what ends up happening is that field commanders, if they lose a position, they will be told to regain it ASAP, and at all costs. This means losing even more manpower for units that are already understaffed, or else they get fired. So field commanders have every incentive to lie and not report the reality on the ground to their superiors. We saw the exact same phenomenon with Ukraine's desertion crisis. Let's have a look at this Facebook post by Andriy Pisarenko, a commander of a mortar battery of the infamous Da Vinci Wolves Battalion. He said that the problem is how these cases are only the ones where officers submitted reports for. But many commanders never actually send these reports on their fighters who have gone AWOL to their superiors in the hierarchy. More often than not because commanders are afraid of punishment, since the status of their personnel is their responsibility. On the 11th of December, Ilya Krotenko, a veteran of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, explained his perspective of the fall of Siversk on Facebook. He explains how in the summer of 2022, his rifle battalion was deployed in Siversk and attached to the 54th Mechanized Brigade. They go through heavy fighting during Ukraine's counteroffensive in early fall. But this also comes at a cost in manpower. He says, I quote, "We're starting to hear rumors that the brigade will be taking out for rotation and rest in October. Then we still believe in it. And the newly formed units are supposed to come in instead of us. Then they promise rotation in November, then by the new year, and then no one promises anything anymore." The brigade, which has been in position since the 21st of September 2022, without rotation or renewal, is defending that direction to this very day. They have been there for 3 years non-stop. Can you imagine that? Absolutely insane. How are all the NATO bots not enraged? You can just imagine the morale of these guys after all these years. But that's not all. He also said, "It seems that my rifle battalion was the last significant replenishment of the unit. At the time when I decided to look for opportunities for transfer on February 25th, the staffing was less than 40%. My friends, this is what attrition looks like. I'm telling you, poor management of human resources is one of the main reasons why Ukraine is currently losing the war." Ilya ended by saying, "And in November, December 2025, the systemic problems with the exhaustion and blood loss of the brigade finally got their expected result. The intensification of the fighting led to increased losses, and it seems that at the end there were simply no infantrymen left to hold the town. That's why it seemed as if the garrison vanished. It did." To support Ilyas Krotenko's claims, I checked the losses of the 54th Mechanized Brigade on ualosses.org. Since October 2022, the brigade has suffered 425 confirmed fatalities. We can add just as many missing in action, for a total of nearly 8,000 soldiers. And then you can add all the wounded. The 54th Mechanized Brigade that was defending Siversk was probably just standing at 20% strength at best. So why didn't the brigade get any major reinforcements despite holding one of the most important positions on the entire front line? According to the veteran Krotenko, the brigade successfully held the defense all this time, which further convinced the command that there was no need to replenish the 54th. More on that in a minute. Because during my research, I discovered something else. The elite Ukrainian K2 battalion of the 54th Mechanized Brigade was turned into the independent 20th Separate Regiment of Unmanned Systems. And if you look through old combat footage from the Siversk sector from 2022 to 2024, it all comes from the K2 battalion. The founder of this K2 battalion, Kirilo Veres, was really one of a kind. He's a true visionary and always emphasized winning beautifully through subtlety, science, and wisdom over brute force. Like we say, with finesse. Colonel Veres is also known for being very blunt about the situation at the front.
Я розумію, що воюємо, але ми виграємо чи програємо війну.
Якщо говорити війну за все, за всі фронти, медійні, там, де бої, програємо. Ми далі йдемо на кордон 91-го року, тільки в обратну сторону. Може, хватить пройобувати, блядь?
However, in May 2025, his K2 regiment was redeployed out of Siversk, and so did many of the best elements of the brigade. To no surprise, this is when Ukrainian forces started giving in that sector. You can check on the map. The Third Russian Army really started making progress in July 2025, just a couple weeks after the redeployment of the K2 regiment. Although the fall of Siversk once again exposed the structural problems within the armed forces of Ukraine, someone still had to bear the blame. Oh no, it's not the genius born at the top. No, not them. On the 27th of December, Militarny reported commanders of 2 brigades to be dismissed after the fall of Siversk. Colonel Oletsky Konoval, the commander of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, was immediately removed from his position. Then it was Colonel Peteshkin, the commander of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, that was also dismissed.
You're all fired.
They were accused of systematically submitting false reports to higher command. They claimed their units still held key positions that had actually been abandoned by troops weeks earlier. We just talked about it, about why they're doing this. It's the system that causes such behavior. It's essentially Ukraine's version of the no-step-back policy, all the while expecting brigades to hold the line without suffering casualties.
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
Now, according to the chief sergeant of the 54th Mechanized Brigade, everything was planned. He said, I quote, "A situation arose where we had to straighten out a section of the front a little, move back a little, and leave the city." If this was actually planned, a planned retrograde maneuver, why were all the commanders fired? I'm telling you, this is pure cope. It doesn't make sense. And that's not all. Brigadier General Serhiy Serchenko, the commander of the entire 11th Army Corps overseeing the Siversk sector, was also removed from his position. As a matter of fact, the entire Ukrainian 11th Army Corps as a whole was disbanded. What a disaster. Now that Siversk fell and that we know why it happened, the next thing on the menu is, what can we expect next? Well, before we can answer, we have to analyze what happened in the past few weeks. After the capture of Siversk by Russia's Third Army, the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade turned its full attention against the village of Sviatopokrovsky. Bomber drones of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade dropped anti-tank mines on the advancing infantry units. Meanwhile, I was surprised to learn that there remained a Ukrainian stronghold north of Siversk, in this mine 2 kilometers north of the town. At the same time, this explains why we haven't seen a real assault on Siversk from the north. That's when the Russian command decided to clear up that position once and for all. In the following footage, we see a handful of Ukrainian soldiers fighting amidst the ruins. It's total chaos. They're trapped with no escape as they get targeted by waves of enemy drones.
All hope is failing, my lord!
And then it's Russian assaulted detachments that show up to mop up any resistance that's left. 1 week later, on the 23rd of December, came Russian armored vehicles. They didn't even participate in the storming of Siversk. By that point, the objective was to push beyond the mine. Here you can see how a fully caged up Russian BMP-2 was immobilized and then destroyed by FPV drones of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade. By the 26th of December, the Russian 3rd Combined Arms Army restarted offensive operations west of Siversk. So they gave themselves a 2-week break to refit before going back on the attack. Ford elements were already spotted 6 kilometers beyond the town and captured all the high ground overlooking the village of Sviatopokrovsky, which, by the way, was now fully contested. 2 days later, on the 28th, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to reclaim the lost ground. We even have a glimpse of the operation. Check this out. We see a tank blasting buildings occupied by Russian troops at point blank, and I counted he fired at least 7 times. That's what the Ukrainians published online. That's their version of the battle. After that, Ukrainian vehicles pushed to the very end of the village, passing through snow-covered fields to dismount their infantry component. That move would effectively encircle enemy forces in Sviatopokrovsky.
A great success!
But then I stumbled on the Russian perspective. In the following footage, we can observe how the drone operators of the 123rd Brigade of the LPR destroyed a first Ukrainian APC, and then the BMP-2 that we just saw, plus a couple buildings held by Ukrainian infantry. These are the type of useless counterattacks that Ukrainian soldiers on the ground keep complaining about. It just increases casualties and it achieves absolutely nothing. At last, by the 31st of December 2025, Russian patrols reached the TO513 road west of Siversk. The 54th Mechanized Brigade went on one last hunt before entering 2026 and intercepted some enemy troops as they tried to sneak by the anti-drone net that used to cover the road going to Siversk. But as you can see, only a handful of Russian soldiers were detected, so you can imagine how many got through unhindered. First week of January, nothing to report. But it's on the 7th of January that things got crispy On Orthodox Christmas Day, Russian infantry units managed to advance another 2 kilometers compared to the positions they occupied the week before. You will recognize the same snowy landscape. I counted 6 Russian soldiers KIA or wounded by the following drone strikes. Meanwhile, Russian drone operators of the 2nd Battalion 123rd Brigade circled over the same region looking for Ukrainian forces. Simultaneously, their comrades from the 88th Brigade continued clearing the village of Sviatopokrovske. Overall fighting had shifted to the western side of the village. The Ukrainian defenders were on the back foot. Now let's zoom in to the granular detail of this battle. In this footage from the 10th of January, we see 2 Russian stormtroopers besieging this house. Despite being supported by multiple drone strikes, they couldn't get in, and eventually they pulled back. And then 1 week later, by the 16th, Ukrainian forces abandoned the settlement of Sviatopokrovske. The battle for Siversk was now truly over. Russian forces not only secured Siversk, but also everything around it in a 5-kilometer radius. So, what can we expect next? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Now that the Siversk fortress, this deadlock, came under Russian control, Russia's Third Army will probably continue its march westwards towards the crown jewels of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. However, it's impossible to know exactly when they'll get there, especially since we can expect Ukrainian resistance to stiffen halfway through, along the Siversky Donetsk Canal, and mostly around the defensive node of Mykolaiivka. Nonetheless, the fall of Siversk is a turning point, because it will bring the battle right inside the heart of Donetsk Oblast. That's all I have for you today. Make sure to check out Black Forest supplements. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.